Hello, my name's Kevin Rudd, President and CEO of Asia Society. This is our original content series, Asian Americans Building America. I call it ABBA, but I'm told that's already a name taken by a certain Swedish pop band, but there you go. We're talking with a wide range of people from vastly different backgrounds who are making a big impact across the United States. And today we're privileged to be joined by Harold Hongju Koh, a Korean American lawyer and legal scholar who served as the legal advisor to the Department of State in the Obama administration. Professor Koh is currently the Sterling Professor of International Law at Yale, where he also has served as Dean. So, Harold, welcome to Asian Americans Building America. Welcome to ABBA. I can't promise any decent music, but there you go. Let's start by you telling us about your family, where you were born, and how you ended up in the US of A. Over to you, my friend.
Well, thank you, Kevin, and I'm grateful to be part of the series. You could have actually have done this program with any one of the members of my family. I'm the fourth of six children. My parents, my father, late father, Kwang Lim Koh, was born on a very small island off the coast of South Korea called Jeju Island, which was a volcanic island, which was during the colonial period, spoke entirely Japanese. My mother was from an extremely wealthy family in Seoul. Her father was a businessman. So in fact, one of the interesting things is, had they not moved to America, they never would have met and never would have been allowed to marry, I don't think, because they were from very different classes. But my father was quite a brilliant student, and he was the first Korean just from the island even to study in Seoul, where he ended up first in his class, and then he won a scholarship to come to Harvard Law School in America. He met my mother, who was
not bad for a boy from Jeju. Even I know where Jeju is, so that's pretty good going, my friend. Shows a lot about getting yourself a scholarship to Harvard back then. So what happened next?
Well, he met my mother, who was a freshman at Dickinson College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. What happened was that his dissertation advisor went to the college, and she showed him around and came back and told my father about this very vivacious and talented young woman. And so it turned out at the time there were probably fewer than 1,000 Koreans on the East Coast of the United States. This was before the Korean normalization period, 1965. So this was back in the 40s. And my father pursued my mother and finally got her to marry him. And then they very quickly had 6 children, of whom I'm the fourth. My oldest sister was a professor and dean in Korea. My next brother is a professor at the Harvard School of Public Health and former assistant secretary for public health in the Obama administration. My next brother is a doctor. I have a sister who was a professor with me at Yale Law School. We were the first brother and sister to hold chairs at Yale University at the same time. And our youngest brother is an artist living in Boston. What happened
That's
was
impressive enough, my friend. It's a big contribution from what began as a very small Korean American community. So it shows something about the level of family aspiration, family ambition, but also public service contribution. So where to go to from there? What happened next?
Well, my father was very interested in democracy in Korea. And at the time, Syngman Rhee was prime minister or president of Korea, and his government collapsed. And so there was the first democratic election, the second Korean Republic, it's called. And my father's friend, who was ambassador to Washington, was one of the candidates to be prime minister. So my father went back and campaigned for him, and he was elected. And they asked my father if he would serve as the foreign minister, even though he's only 39 years old. But his view was that the more important job was to be the ambassador in Washington. There was no ambassador, so they made him the chargé. And we moved to Washington, D.C. when I was about 5 years old. What happened next was really probably the most important event that shaped me. My father learned from friends of his at the National Security Council that the government was going to be overthrown by a coup d'etat. He went and tried to warn the prime minister, and the prime minister said, no, this will be taken care of by our chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who turned out to be Pak Chung-hee, who in fact did the coup, and the government was overthrown. And a couple of days later, my father was told that the prime minister, his friend, would be executed. And so he went to the White House and asked to see Walt Rostow, who was the deputy national security advisor, who he had known from his previous meetings.
So we're talking about which administration, Kennedy or Johnson?
The Kennedy administration.
Yeah.
And they went in to see Rostow, and Rostow said, we know where the prime minister is, and we assure you he will not be harmed. And my father was just staggered by the reach of American power, that it could reach across the world and assure that this prime minister would not be executed. And then Rostow said to my father, what about you? What are you doing now? And my father said, well, I'm exiled and I'm unemployed and I have 6 children. And he said, well, you know, my brother's dean of Yale Law School in New Haven. Aren't you a law professor? And my father said, yes. So he called him. and apparently the call lasted less than a minute. And my father thought there was no way that anything could have happened on that call that was significant. And Rostow suddenly realized he was there, and he said, no. He said, could you get here in a week? And a week later, each of us had a suitcase and we moved to New Haven. And 40 years later, I was dean of Yale Law School. My sister was a chaired professor at Yale Law School. So that's a real American story. Yeah. But there's another half. There's another half of this.
There are worse places to be than New Haven, my friend. So yeah, what's the other half?
The other half was that my father and his colleagues at the embassy gathered, and they all took an oath that they would never serve a military government. And they all signed the document. I think 60 people signed. Within a year, all of them were serving the military government except my father. And so he was exiled as a result, pretty much for the rest of his life. I actually asked him once, well, why didn't you just serve the government? And he said, you know, anyone can serve in the government. If you say what they want you to say, they'll figure out a role that you can play. And he said, but the question is not what job you have, the question is what you stand for. And so he was the most well-known person who never joined the government. Many years later, and this was in fact the de facto end of the story, I was with Secretary Albright in North Korea for the first meeting Kim Jong-il, and we flew back to South Korea. And in fact, you know, my mother had actually been in North Korea when the country was divided, and only after 3 months of planning did she escape and get to the South. Had this happened, you know, whatever version of me would have been born would have been born in North Korea. But when we got to the Blue House, we met with Kim Dae-jung, who was, you know, the prime minister, as you know, also the Nobel Peace Prize winner. And when the meeting started, he suddenly stopped the meeting and he said, I'd like to point out that the son of Hongju Koh is here. And he was the person who was, to all of us who thought that Korean democracy was possible, a great hero. And his son is representing the United States as the Assistant Secretary for Human Rights. And I want you to know that your father did the right thing. And my father at that point was dead, but that moment convinced me that he had done the right thing.
Well, the arc of history bends slowly towards justice, my friend, as you as a law professor will understand full well. And many Americans have forgotten the brutality of Park Chung-hee's administration. I haven't. And many of us who tracked then the future history of the military dictatorship through others, including Chun Du-hwan, and what happened in Gwangju and what happened then with the eventual overthrow of the military regime. This was an extraordinary period. And it says much about the resilience of your family and your father, that they stood for a continuity of democratic principles during a particularly ugly phase in the history of the ROK. Tell me about your work in the Obama administration. What was your job? What did you do? And tell us a little about your experience of being such a prominent Korean American working in public life.
Well, maybe I should answer a prior question, which is how did I become a lawyer? And what happened was I was a college student at Harvard, and I went to Korea for the summer. It was the summer of 1974. And Park Chung-hee, there was an assassination attempt on him. It ended up killing his wife. And they sealed the country and they closed the borders. And there were tanks in the street, and no one could leave. And so I was sort of stuck there. And I called my father, and meanwhile, we're watching television, and Nixon was leaving office and Gerald Ford was becoming the president. And I said to my dad, I can't believe it. Korea is this small country, and they can't seem to pass power peacefully. And the United States, the most powerful country in the world, has just turned power over to someone who many people at the time made fun of, Gerald Ford, for being, they thought, arguably unqualified, with no tanks rolling in the street, no constitutional challenge. And he said, now you know why I became a lawyer. He said the difference in a democracy, if you're the president, the troops will obey you. But in a dictatorship, if the troops obey you, they will call you president. And that was the first time I understood the difference between a rule of law and the rule of individuals. And so I decided I would become a lawyer, and an international lawyer. I think because I had lived my life between two cultures, Asia and the United States, I thought that international law was the best thing that I could do. And so what really happened in the Obama administration was that Hillary Clinton became Secretary of State. I had worked as Assistant Secretary for Human Rights in the Clinton administration, where I had done work with the First Lady's office, Hillary Clinton's office. And so she asked me to be her legal advisor. And so for 4 years, I headed the legal office, which was about 250 lawyers, maybe 400 people. Most interesting international law firm practice in the world. And we did treaty negotiations. We argued cases at the International Court of Justice, cases before domestic courts. We did crisis diplomacy. I was in Beijing when a blind Chinese activist, Chen Guangcheng, went into the embassy, and my job was to help get him out, and we did. And we worked on a zillion issues. Many of them were completely cutting edge. One involved Australia, which is the question of if you have a same-sex couple who have a child, and the mother who bears the child to term is Australian, but there's no genetic relationship between the other mother and the fetus, and the fetus is born in the United States. What is the nationality of the child? And under the laws that had existed, we would be forced to declare that child stateless. And instead, what we did was we construed the words, there must be a natural relationship between the mother and the child, to include being held in a gestational relationship with the mother for 9 months. So if you were carried to term, you would acquire US citizenship. And that issue, so-called the assisted reproductive technologies, goes on. So there was no day that some issue of modern technology didn't arise. Drone warfare, or cyber conflict, or artificial intelligence, or climate change. It was a completely fascinating job.
Tell me, Harold, in your professional life and in your reflection of the things that you've done, both at Yale, which is a deeply progressive community. You've spoken about the Clinton administration, the Obama administration, progressive administrations, but in your working life, what's been your experience in terms of racism? Have you experienced that in the workplace? Have you experienced that in the community? And because you're so well wired with the Korean American community, what are your reflections on what's it like to be on the receiving end of racism?
I've been throughout my life, I think, the victim of, or not the victim, but I've experienced race consciousness. People don't know how to deal with Asian Americans. I've been asked a million times, where are you from? Or, I'm from New Haven, Connecticut. And, but no, like, where are you really from? I'm from New Haven, Connecticut. Now, one thing you notice is that you call me Harold Hongju Koh. My first publication, which was when I was a law student, I put Harold Koh, K-O-H, and my father said, there's an Australian guy named Harold Koh, C-O-E, and you shouldn't be confused with him. So why don't you put Harold Hongju Koh, and people will know you're Korean. But when I was growing up, people would say, I know where China and Japan is. I know where Vietnam is. Where's Korea? I don't know where Korea is. Even though many people had lived through or fought in the Korean War. Or there was a statement that, Korean products are junk. I remember when the first Korean automobile, the Hyundai, was developed. A lot of people said, I would never buy a car like that. It's not high quality. When we were with my dad in Washington, it was not long after Brown versus the board, the school desegregation case. And Washington, D.C. was a place of tremendous de facto segregation. And I was in a school that had just been integrated. And in the class there were a lot of black kids and a lot of white kids, and then there was me. And we went out for a recess, and the black kids formed their own team and went off to play, and the white kids formed their own team and went off to play. And there I was by myself. Nobody knew where to put me. I think growing up and in all the things I've done, I generally don't see other Asians there. Or maybe one or two. At the beginning, there was very little pan-Asian consciousness. I'll never forget when I went to Harvard Law School. My first day in the cafeteria, I walked out And I noticed that the students were largely sitting, eating lunch by race. And there was two tables where Asian students were sitting. I didn't know any of them, but I thought, well, maybe I should at least sit down with one of these Asian tables. So I sat down with my lunch, and then another student said, this is the West Coast Asians table. The East Coast Asians are sitting over there.
That's a very funny story.
So, and, the uptight Ivy League East Coast Asians sit over there. We are the cool West Coast Asians. So anyway, so I've had many experiences of that nature. When I represented Haitian refugees as a human rights lawyer, I got I'd say hundreds of emails, letters with racial slurs and attacking me. But there was a very interesting moment. I went to a Korean American banquet during that period, and I gave a speech about the Haitians and how they were being treated and how we should speak up. And elderly Korean got up and just said, why aren't you helping our people? Why are you helping these Black people? And I said, you mean to say in the face of Haitian boat people, you don't see Vietnamese boat people? And in the desire for Haitian democracy, you don't see Korean democracy. And in Haitian internment, you don't see Japanese internment. And what Martin Luther King said is, we may have come in different boats, but we're in the same boat now. And if you think that we, the Asian community, can sit back and ignore mistreatment of other races and then expect it not to get to the Asian community, you're living a fantasy life. Now, by the way, that wasn't very respectful of my Asian elder, but that's the American side of me speaking up. I
think, as you know, racism isn't an exclusive phenomenon in let's call it the European world. It's bad, but racism within, let's call it, continental and archipelagic Asia is a problem itself in terms of Asian racial stereotypes. And you've referred to a few of those. I'm still taken aback by the West Coast and East Coast folks at the Harvard Law School cafeteria. That still sticks in my memory. Last question for you, Harold, and that is, if you are speaking today with a young Chinese American, Korean American, Vietnamese American who, in their first week at university somewhere in the United States, gets the big question, which you wrestled with all those years ago, which is, where are you from? Where are you really from? Have you worked out what the best response is to this persistent and, shall I say, covertly racist question? Because I'm sure there's a whole bunch of young Asian Americans who are looking for the best way through that particularly awkward question. Given as a non-American myself, I never get asked that question.
I'd say, where am I from? I'm from the United States of America. And the United States of America is unusual in that we don't have a single ethnicity. We don't have a single religion. We don't have a single tribe. What holds us together as a people is a commitment to a common belief that, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all persons are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. And it's the commitment to that human rights value and the belief in human rights and the rule of law, that common belief is what makes us Americans. So that's where I'm from. I'm from the land of human rights and the rule of law.
Well, thank you so much, Harold, for your time with us today. And I've got to say, as someone whose ancestors also came on boats to Australia, and we're just a pack of British criminals in this country, who ended up on the wrong side of the law. And then, courtesy of the success of the American Revolution, ended up not in Savannah, Georgia, but in Sydney, Australia. What MLK said about we've all come on different boats is absolutely right. Apart from Native Americans and apart from Indigenous Australians, we've got some fundamental rights in terms of being the original occupants of the lands which we now call home. Professor Harold Koh, thank you for being with us today. And let me remind everyone of what your father said. Professor Harold Hongju Koh, we really appreciate you sharing your incredible family story with us and all the work you do to bring justice around the world. I'm Kevin Rudd. I'm from the Asian Society. Thank you for joining us.